Zero waste cutting. So what is it and why, right? So um, this has to do with sustainability. Okay, so sustainable fashion, also called eco fashion, is a part of the growing design philosophy and trend of sustainability. The goal is to create a system of design, manufacturing, recycling, regulations, and also a reduction and conservation of materials. All of these being supported indefinitely in terms of affecting the human impact on the environment and the need for social responsibility. As a designer, you may not have the choice of the fabrics you use or the places and ways in which your garments are manufactured, but you can explore ways to develop your own designs to use the least amount of fabric possible. This technique of pattern manipulation is called zero waste and seeks to take out all waste from the pattern and cutting process. Textile waste is a growing problem. We have become gluttons of collecting and getting rid of barely worn things. The massive amount of sameness in the market, along with constant production, has led us to think that garments are harmlessly disposable. But here are the facts. According to the EPA, 13.1 million tons of textile are trashed every year, with only 15% being recovered for reuse and recycling. The average American trashes near 65 pounds of textiles each year, and almost half Americans throw away reusable textiles. We need to create and follow steps to reduce and eventually eliminate waste in the garment industry. We start with a greater understanding of the problem and an immediate change of intent and focus. We can work through the pyramid of zero waste hierarchy to arrive at acceptable regulations on production amounts, production methods, and raw materials. As the designer, you should have an interest in reversing the damage that those who have come before you have caused. The garment industry is going to need to adapt to the shift in consumer attitudes and the greater demand for disclosure and ethics in this manufacturing of garments. The majority of consumers that are socially conscious are between the age of 40, are below the age of 40, and they're willing to pay more for socially responsible products. If you want a job that has, if you want a job that has roots in the future, you need to be aware of and create sustainable practices for your industry. As designers, you can start at the most fundamental level by taking your design inspirations with silhouettes and figuring out how to engineer the patterns to create the least amount of waste. In these photos, the patterns are laid out with directional cutting and causing a lot of fallout, which is the fabric in between the pattern pieces that will be thrown away. Remember I talked about fallouts earlier? In these photos, we have moved from directional cutting to non-directional cutting, which has helped to work the patterns into the type marker and lessen the fabric fallout. You guys know what directional cutting means? So
it's following the grain, correct?
No, actually, directional.
Oh.
If you look at the right side, it basically means that the entire jacket is cut all go in one direction, meaning the top always go to the other direction, the same direction. On the left side, it shows you maybe this is the sleeve and that's the side. So one side is going up, one side going down. So it like make the puzzle fit a little better. That's called directional cutting. So non-directional cutting, like when we put everything to one side going up all the time, sometimes it's limited by, if you have a print that has an image that you want the head to face up all the time, then you would need directional cutting. Or sometimes when the fabric has a nap, like velvet has a nap, so only brush a certain direction, So then you always want the whole garment to have the same shade, right? So that's called directional cutting. So anyway, but as you can see these photos, when you make a marker for only one garment, you still have quite a bit of fabric waste left over. So the right side is one directional, the left side is non-directional, but you still waste fabric. So I'll show you this this marker, and we saw a little marker earlier, right? So in this photo, adding multiple sizes into the same non-directional marker helps even more to reduce the fallout of the fabrics. As the spaces between the pattern pieces becomes less and more garments are being cut. But as layers of fabric are piled on top of each other and the marker is cut, there is still a large pile of small fabric pieces left over. You see the black in between on the right side, those are all fallout. And the left, the white in between, those are fallout. So even though you can be very good at doing the puzzle, but a lot of times you can't still fit everything in there, right? You still have a little area that you're gonna lose. And these photos basically show the fabric waste of those fallouts. I mean, you can see on the top, the yellow, they're just chunks of fabric that are being wasted. So the definition of zero waste patterns is where all pattern pieces or garment are interlocked together when laid out onto the fabric for cutting, so that every inch of that fabric is being used. As a designer, a lot of thought process needs to go into the planning of your sketch and the pattern making puzzle. Like if you look at the top here, you see they're almost interlocking every single seam, right? It's difficult to do because you may not get the same shape all the time, right? Every line. So this photo is another example of a zero waste design and pattern fallout, right? You see that? They're almost like every line is butting to each other. I know you guys are used to cutting out your patterns and want to place the pattern in the middle of the fabric, so you're afraid that you'll cut into the pattern, right? So, but these, you're literally cutting right next to each other. So there's no mistake of cutting, and always use every inch of the fabric. Missed one page, sorry. There can be a disconnect between the designing of a garment and the production process. The reason for this is that much of design process is focused only on creating that ideas with sketches or flats, while the patterning and construction is being done in another country far away from the designer's eyes. The zero waste, or we call it reverse engineered process of creating and making a design, makes a very close relationship between the designers and the production of the garment, as all aspects of the finished shape and fit will be controlled by the person who designed it. This hands-on three-dimensional process is an edge for the designer who understands pattern making and construction as much as the topical aesthetic of the design. So I have a student, he's a senior now, and they just did the AG mentor project, which they were recycling, and his challenge, he decided to take on a challenge as doing zero waste. So we try, and we did a denim jacket, which we start slicing into the pattern, sleeve pattern, and just try to, I think at the end, we came up with a really good consumption, like minimize the wastage of the fabric. So that was a really good experience for him and for me as well. I haven't done this in a long time. So here's another example of a custom printed zero waste design. So Japanese kimonos are a great example of zero waste design. The kimono garment is constructed from woven panels of fabric, traditionally 14 inches wide. An entire bolt of 12.5 yards is used to make the kimono. So nothing is wasted or cut off. So no sewing machine and the high cost of textile make conservation extremely necessary. Another example is Japanese textile recycling practices during the 18th and 19th century were deep-seated in the Japanese folk culture. Japanese work clothing was hand-woven and hand-stitched at home. There wasn't an excess of textiles, so all materials were conserved and reused. One example of this garment is called boro, which means ragged or tattered. Boro is a patchwork style that grew out of need as opposed to aesthetics. Boro techniques were applied when a garment started to get thin and a hole appeared. It was then patched and mended with small pieces of recycled scrap fabric and joined with a running stitch called sashiko. A boro garment is repaired and reused for many generations. Boro showed us the beauty of practicality and time spent, not money. The example shown here is a boro jacket. The material was woven on a loom during the early 19th century, with patches sewn on as needed up until the late 19th century. It's almost 100-year old. I'm sure this is in the museum now. Sakiori is another example of Japanese recycling. I hope I'm not butchering Japanese haruka. The sakiori fabric created from using a sturdy warp thread such as hemp and a weft thread of torn recycling fabric strips, therefore turning the scraps into yarn. This yarn was woven into cloth and used for clothing and other household textiles. Picture here is a sakiori jacket that dates back to the early 20th century. This last example of Japanese recycling from the early 20th century is a vest with sashiko stitching. It involves stitching together up to 5 layers of recycled cotton to make a warm and durable work garment. The Japanese took great pride in their work to reuse and recycle fabrics, and plaid pay special attention when mending an item for its reuse. You can see here, they literally fold it back and then just slip stitch the patch on at the from the bottom end. So that's switch continent. Okay, during the turn of the century, the British used smocking to control the size and volume of the shift dress. I don't know if you guys tried smocking stitches in sophomore. I'm not familiar with if you guys actually did it. So this dress was cut and assembled from a series of different size squares. The top portion of the dress was smocked to the size needed for the wearer. This could be let out as the wearer grew or passed on to another person who could then redo the smocking and adjust the size if needed. So basically, one size fit all, and just make it tighter, make it smaller. The idea of zero waste has been explored by many master drapers in the history of fashion. Although not entirely zero waste, the master draper, Madeleine Vionnet, worked through many ideas using blocks of fabric with clever twists and cuts as shown in this illustration. You can see this shape, and it turns to this. Here's another example of the 1920s French zero waste fashions, which utilize large fabric blocks and eliminate fabric waste. All right, fast forward to 1970s, where conservation at that time is not high on anyone's priority. 70 is about freedom. It's about, this and that spending. So Halston created a series of dresses with the techniques of a spiral cut pattern. Here's where a long piece of satin was folded into diagonal, continuous fold, creating a long fabric tubes and bias. Then it was sewn together in one seam. There was no fallout in this column like dress, and being on the bias helped to show the curves of the body. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I tried making a little miniature, and you can actually fold it into a tube. It's pretty awesome. And in a project called APOC, which stands for a piece of cloth, which was created by the innovative and avant-garde designer Issey Miyake. The revolutionary forms of clothing was created by a computer program industrial knitting machines, which produces continuous tubes of fabric. The fabric contains a blueprint of a garment. The wearers use scissors to cut out and create garment they want to wear. And because of the embedded seams, fabrics can be cut without unraveling, allowing a complete customization for any body and size. Every single inch of the fabric can be made into a garment or accessories such as bags, socks, and underwear. And here's that piece of cloth displayed in different colors. Okay, now let's look at some pattern manipulation. Here's a t-shirt pattern cut on a bias. Okay, just look at the line, it's diagonal, right? So the front and back patterns are in miniature scale. Here they are, lay as close together as possible within the total width of the fabric. Put a ruler, it's miniature. So it takes about 13.5 units to cut one shirt. As you can see, there's so much negative space, all this black space. So a large amount of waste in fabric. Now we slice and rearrange portion of the front and back patterns without adding any seams. We're able to save some fabric, from 13.5 to 10 units. However, there are still significant wastage of fabric with cutting only one garment. You see still some black spaces. And if we slice and rearrange the portion of the front and back patterns without any seams, okay, so I went through this already. So this one, sorry. And if we rearrange the patterns on a marker by stacking the front and back, one above the other, we have now reached 18.5 units. And we can also place another set of front and back directly on top of the first set. That gives you single yield of the garment of 9.25 units. Save a lot more fabric. And from here, you can look at the remaining fallouts for other creative use, such as perhaps triangle shapes as skirts, or perhaps as pockets. The possibilities are there for the creative minds if you choose to follow the practice of zero waste. And here are some other examples of creative pattern making, like Halston, a basic t-shirt can be sliced and seem like a puzzle and without changing the overall shape of the t-shirt. Some of them look like, Japanese origami. And here are some of the variation of other, variation of that pattern come up from the same t-shirt. And in this type of zero waste, the edges are cut into a lace-like patterns, then sewn with the seams to the outside, creating details and structure all at once. There's a lot of texture, a lot of, like dimensional. Another great example of a kimono type coat where the sleeves are placed at the cutout space, achieving zero waste. You see here in the middle, there's line right next to the other. So there's nothing in between fallout. Here's an example of how carefully planned and executed patterns of stripe pattern can be used in zero waste. Just the angle of the stripes will make it very interesting visually. And here's what the process is done in reverse. So they take a finished garment made of unconventional patterns, cut it apart, and reshape the patterns pieces, or redrafting some patterns to fit into the fallout area without losing the overall look of the original. These patterns are often cut from a single rectangular piece of fabric. Through clipping and foldings and with accurate matching notches, okay, another thing I always going to remind you, matching notches, we can create different type of garment like this hooded jacket. And here's an example of a woman's jacket, patterned and cut from a triangle. A rectangle, not triangle. And finally, this method, they put specific data of the pattern, such as color, the jacquard design, and the dimensions. They enter it into a computerized loom to weave and produce the exact pattern pieces, bypassing the step of cutting completely, leaving them to only be sewn together. But this is an example of zero waste without absolutely no fallout and without sacrificing the fit. So, however, this process is very, very costly. And here's the final product. Well, personally, I don't think that's very pretty, but it followed the zero waste. So not all great ideas are pretty. So you have to really plan and still keep your aesthetics. So take what you learned about zero waste today and go ahead and change the world one pattern at a time.